Good evening. Thanks so much. If you cannot hear me, just wave hands. I'm just curious how many of you are from the community and how many are from campus. Is there any of you who came because you saw the ad in the Fairbanks, the Daily Miner? That's, oh my goodness, that's about half of you. There's about 40 people here right now. So advertising in newspapers pays off, yes. Well, good. Yes, I've been spending the last couple days, going around buildings and dorms and local cafes to put up stuff. Okay, and yes, as Brian said, if those of you who are interested in some of the stuff I've written, Julia Taylor has very kindly agreed to sell 3 books I've done. One's a children's book, one's a book on people who live in Christian communes, and another one is about people who quit church, which apparently is I could spend a whole night talking about that. It's an ever-growing segment of the American population. And I've just been kind of amazed at how people, even evangelical Christians are becoming disenchanted. But that's not what I'm speaking about tonight. However, I did write a book about it, so okay, commercial over. Okay, and I want to tell you a bit about myself before launching into my topic. Born in Baltimore, daughter of a Coast Guard officer who became an admiral in 1975, I believe. And I grew up mainly on the East Coast. And let's see, I would say I started out as a child. Now, I decided to become a journalist when I was working as the features editor of my 8th grade newspaper in Severna Park, Maryland, which says there is something good about school newspapers. I mean, some of us do get the call when we are working for them. I moved as a 15-year-old to Seattle, which was a city my family has adopted as their hometown. Back in 1971, by the way, Seattle was not the glamorous place it has since become. In fact, I attended high school in Redmond, home of Microsoft, but before Microsoft got there, I had one fast food restaurant. Today it's a city of 56,000, population is up 25% since 2000, and housing prices are out of sight. Should have bought back then. I mean, what was it? My parents bought in 1971 a home with a view of Lake Sammamish for $42,000, and they sold it 30 some years later for $600,000 something. They've never quite told me the price, but they did well. Remember, I mean, I don't know how many of you are from Seattle at all, but remember the era when the last person out of Seattle, please turn off the lights, when Boeing was not doing well. So we moved over there anyway, so I really got to know this part of the country. I freelanced in high school for some local newspapers, went to Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and got my first journalism job in Oregon City, about 10 miles south of Portland. I don't know if there's any Oregonians here or from, I see a, oh my good, Clackamas County. Whoa. Okay, it's interesting, my former newspaper there is long defunct, as is the next newspaper I worked for in Florida. Speaking of Florida, yes, I did some investigative reporting when I wasn't sitting there on the lounge. But anyway, one of the editors of the tiny daily I worked for in Oregon said I had 2 choices: edit the agriculture page or edit the religion page. I have nothing against agriculture, but I decided religion was by far more interesting and controversial. I get more people mad at me. So I'd also seen what a miserable job the Oregonian was doing about religion reporting. I knew I could do better, and I think I did. Now, one of my brothers got a job at the Oregonian. He is still there 30 some years later, but I could never get on there, so I moved to Florida. And then after 3.5 years in the Miami area, I became one of 2 religion reporters for the Houston Chronicle. What a great beat. Because especially in the late 1980s with the PTL scandals, the Jimmy Swaggart scandals, there were just scandals everywhere. And in fact, I was there when I flew to Baton Rouge and covered him when he's sobbing at the microphone. It was fun. He wept all over the pulpit, and I never understood, his wife Frances was looking on, and she wore shocking pink, the color you're wearing. And I mean, now if I was the wife of an errant preacher, I would not be wearing shocking pink because the TV cameras just glum on you. And I don't know if she was just hated the journalists and just, wanted to stay up yours or what. I mean, I don't know. But it was in your face that everyone had to reckon with her. I always remember that. Tons of reporters were there, and after the service, Swiggert's lawyer was passing out press releases in the foyer. And I thought, I love this beat. Well, moments like that, in fact, in 1988, that was in 1988, now in 1987, got to cover slightly holier individual, Pope John Paul, his swing through southern United States as he would stride back and forth on the stage with his crucifix. I don't know if any of you remember those days, but he would sort of like take a step and, pose like that. That was, he was a younger guy at the time, but he would just work the crowd like the actor he had been. And those moments made me really glad I'd chosen to cover such a fascinating beat. I think some of you remember this moment where, I don't know if any of you were there when the Pope met with Reagan I guess they didn't really step outside the airport, did they? They just kind of...
Oh, no, well, he did. Reagan stayed overnight.
Oh, he stayed overnight, but the Pope just sort of...
He was just...
I heard...
Open the door.
The Pope... Well, my sources tell me that there's like some red carpet still here. I mean, oh yeah, okay. It's sort of like a icon.
The Howling Dog. They have some of
The Howling Dog. Oh, it's at a tavern?
Yeah, Dog Saloon.
So Alaskan. Well, anyway, I just thought you all would like that moment. But the late associated, now a bit of statistics. The late Associated Press writer George Cornell, whose beat was religion, of course, did some research in 1992 because we had heard that people spend billions on religion and millions on sports. Of course, I never was a sports reporter. The brother at the Oregonian always said, you would have done better if you had taken up sports writing. But anyway, I said I can't stand sports. But anyway, George Cornell found that 56 billion was contributed by Americans to religious groups, 14 times more than the 4 billion spent that year on professional baseball, basketball, and football combined. And according to a Gallup poll, attendance at religious functions totaled 5.6 billion in 1993. That's 55 times greater than the 103 million Americans who attended professional football, baseball, basketball games that year. And so do we see that reflected in our local media? Well, we all know the answer. I don't know Alaska media well enough to comment, but I will say that the Religion News Writers Association, which is the professional journalist group of people I belong to, they cover religion news in the secular media. They have no members in Alaska except for me. So I'm guessing the Anchorage and Fairbanks papers don't have anybody covering religion. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't belong to the major group of journalists who do so who knows. Okay, but now again we have the brief 1984 visit. The meeting with President Reagan attracted 5,000 people. John Paul's February 26, 1981 visit to Anchorage, this is all stuff I'm just reviewing, has been the largest ever gathering of people in this state. Just thought you might want to know. Isn't it true, though, we have a sports section every day? But if more people are involved in religion than sports, why isn't there a daily religion section? No one, I don't expect you to come up with an answer, no one ever has one. But I remember when the Dallas Morning News, which had the country's best religion section, huge multi-page thing, won prizes all the time, they cut that section in 2009, and there's hardly ever a peep. Dallas is full of churches. I mean, just chock-a-block, but very little protest. Can you imagine the ruckus had they cut coverage of the Dallas Cowboys? It would have been bad. So it seems like religion gets put in this private sphere where practitioners shouldn't expect decent coverage, whereas economics, business, health, education, sports, politics, and so on belong to a public sphere that merits space. Again, I've covered things other than religion, but I have noticed that there is this weird, separation of church and state kind of in, the wall in the newsroom, and newspapers just don't want to go there. Okay, well, after Houston, I decided I wanted to learn more about some of the stuff I was covering. I went to seminary, got that first master's degree, went to Washington, D.C., which is nirvana for any reporter of anything. I mean, there's 5,000 journalists there. It's a place where when you call people and say, I'm on deadline, like they say, they jump, they go, yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, and they really run. Whereas you try doing that anywhere else in the country, and they're like, well, we'll get back in touch with you in a day or two if you're lucky. But I mean, everyone is so professional with the media in Washington. So it's such a pleasure. And the media are so powerful in Washington. So if you call, I mean, there's actually people there who they actually want to talk to you, like politicians, because they always want to be in their hometown papers. So it was just a rich place to be, no matter what the administration, the Clinton, well, you know what the late 90s were like with the Clinton administration. It was just rich. It was fun, Monica Beach, if you remember that. And it was fun. We had a good time. And in fact, because I was only going to be in Washington 2 years, but it was such fun being there, I ended up being there 16 years. As you can read up there was the White House beat, and that would have been a great place to be. But I've just felt everyone's covering the White House. And there's so few people covering what I like to cover, which is, well, I like, education, I like health, but religion is one of the things I like, and culture wars stuff like that too. Anyway, I want to get into some of the really meaningful stories that I've done, and stories I think should mean something to people, starting in 2005. I ran into a French reporter who'd been reporting on the huge gender disparities in India. It was known as female feticide. Don't know if anyone's heard of it, but there's far fewer girls than boys there, same as in China. And the reason being that girls are very expensive to marry off. You need about $20,000 for the dowry of your daughter. And so most families figure they can do that once, and that's it. So there's a system, and then if you knew you were pregnant with a girl after that, well, there are ways to get rid of her. And the system was, if you were about 4 months pregnant, that's about the time you know the sex of your child, you'd go get a sonogram. And if it was a girl, they'd abort her. Well, the Indian government wised up to this and made it illegal for sonogram technicians to reveal the child's sex, but there are ways around it. Now, if the fetus was a girl, the doctor would say something like, better save your money, and that was code for, you've got a couple dowries to pay, so you're gonna be poor. Or if it was a boy, they'd say, oh, it's time to celebrate. So they couldn't, the police couldn't get them on saying it's a boy or girl, because they hadn't actually done that, but we knew. Of course they'd done that. Anyway, the French reporter was trying to find American journalists who would travel to India and report on this horrible trend as a way of gaining a momentum of world opinion so that the Indian government would be really shamed into doing something about it. Because, it was a huge, people all over India knew about this, but the Indian government wasn't doing much. So I put together a 3-week trip to the Indian cities of Lucknow, Kanpur, Delhi, and some small towns north of Delhi that were known for their high abortion rates. Just matter of interest, the religions, of course I always think the religion angle, that had the worst abortion rates were the Jains and the Sikhs. Now the Jains are the people, if a fly lands on them, they don't want to kill it, but they had the highest per capita abortions. Next came the Hindus, then the Muslims, then the Christians were last. But anyway, I went to Bangalore, where there was a feminist movement against female feticide, and Jaipur in Rajasthan, which is the picture you can see up there, because if any of you have ever been to Rajasthan, people just dress in these really, really bright desert colors. Okay, anyway, east of Jaipur were Muslim communities where there weren't enough women because of the skewed sex ratio, so the men had bought women who were trafficked in from eastern India and Nepal. They were telling me, the things you discover when you're a reporter, you're sitting in this kind of hut, and there's the whole village is gathered around, and they're saying, oh yeah, we know about women being trafficked. We get some in Nepal, and there's a huge sex slave market in Bihar, which is like a Indian province, eastern India, and that's where we go. And all these trucks come in, and we pile the women or girls onto trucks, and we just cart them around India. You just think this is a nightmare. And they talk about it like they're selling potatoes. And I thought this is such a world crime. So, here is Jaipur, known for its lovely pink red walls. But we saw the back roads of Jaipur because my photographer and we traveled, we visited the private homes of the sonogram operators. We would sort of jump out at them like we were a TV crew. and asking them why they were sending women who were pregnant with girls to abortion clinics. In fact, what helped us is there was and this is where you kind of learn to work with a local journalist. There was a local TV station that had done a sting operation at one of these clinics. A pregnant reporter, she was outfitted with a hidden camera and microphone, which poses someone who wanted to abort her girl baby. And 100 out of 150 clinics this team visited, they surveyed about 2/3 of these clinics, urged them, just refer them to the abortion clinic down the street. Now, the TV station had gotten regional publicity for this stunt, but our goal was to write them up for a Washington, D.C. audience. And if any of you have been in D.C., you know that activists all over the world know that anything printed in or around Washington has 100 times more impact than things printed or broadcast elsewhere. I do not mean to insult people who work for the Chicago Tribune, Arizona Republic, whatever, but to be kind of snotty about it, but it's true. Anything just published anywhere in Washington just gets, everybody reads it because there's embassies everywhere. Again, the 5,000 journalists, a lot of them are international, and you just get amazing exposure. So we would use this as a way of shaming certain people. If you found a cause you believed in or you thought should be reported on, well, you reported on it. And I tell you, a lot of times if you reported on like an activist or someone who is in prison, and you put their name in the paper in Washington, I'll tell you that embassy heard about it, and people back home got some heat, which is how one Pakistani prisoner of conscience I know got free because of one of my articles. I just sort of made some noise about it in something I wrote, and I heard through the back door from some human rights group that he'd been freed. So, I mean, which is a mission of journalism. I know a lot of you have heard this, journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And that's really a calling of journalism. You want to bother the people who might be involved in things that maybe they shouldn't be involved in, whether they're corrupt or in this country or somewhere else. Well, anyway, never planned to be in Washington 16 years, but again, it was really, I really liked being in the center of media stuff. So anyway, I got LIDF in 2010. I will explain this photo in just a minute. I got to freelance for publications I'd always wanted to write for, Economist, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. Got to do some articles for the Post Sunday magazine, and at one point I was in a field in eastern Pennsylvania doing an article on Christian anarchists. And I really liked the photographer the Post had assigned to be with me, and after we did that assignment, she told me of something else she'd been researching. She'd been traipsing into West Virginia to research an out-of-the-way community called Jolo. Is anyone here from West Virginia? Just wondered. Okay, well, if you haven't been there, it's not the happiest place. Everything from food deserts to mountaintop removal. And anyway, a place called Jolo, where people were dying of black lung. Life expectancies for both men and women were some of the worst in the country, and where there were Pentecostal churches where people handled snakes. Well, as you can see, this photo of me in India is the closest I've come to handling a snake. This guy gave me this black thing and said, here. It wasn't a cobra, so I took it. But you can see my screaming mouth. I was not too thrilled with a snake, but I don't like snakes. Did not want to report on people who handle snakes. Now, I reported on everything from Southern Baptists to Satanists in my career, but this is a group I'd never gotten close to. One reason, I detested Appalachia. I had biked through eastern Kentucky as a college student. It was not a good experience. Didn't want to go back there. Harlan County, I felt, was the pits. And but the photographer wanted to do more on these folks. I was in between jobs. I knew the Washington Post paid decent freelance money. So I pitched one of their editors on sending the two of us to West Virginia for a long weekend on how to researching how snake handling was dying out among these Pentecostal groups. So I'm going to tell you a few stories about these people and kind of how I've gotten involved in kind of a current story that I'm working on. Hopefully it will be a book. Just a little bit, if those of you who are not religion scholars or know much about snakes. The custom reached its 100th year anniversary fairly recently. It originated in 1909 or 1910 in eastern Tennessee with a preacher called George Hensley. A little bit of theology here. He felt that if Mark 16, which Bible verse I'll put up in just a minute, if Mark 16, 17 through 18 mandated that Christians heal people and speak in tongues, and the same verses would mandate them to pick up poisonous snakes. Most people say that's the worst kind of Bible translation they've ever read, but anyway, no mainstream Christian group agrees with it. But anyway, off we went to Jolo. I'd never been anywhere like it, as poor as any urban ghetto, full of people on drugs, meth, you name it. We found a famous church in Jolo that specialized in snake handling. But after 3 days there, I discovered a couple unexpected things. First of all, I took my at the time 6-year-old daughter with me, and I was really afraid. As some water moccasin kind of jump on her. Do they throw copperheads around or something? And I didn't know what they did, so I kind of put her in the way back. Well, first of all, there's lots of kids in these churches, and places it's kind of like here, whereas like the kind of altar area, no one under 18 goes beyond like a certain point. And up here, they're all handling the snakes, as you will see. This gentleman is doing. I think that's a rattler. I don't know if it's, again, I don't know my snakes that well, but I think that's a rattlesnake. I like the people I was interviewing. They weren't wacko folks. Again, I'd come in, reporters aren't supposed to have preconceptions, and I had some. They seemed pretty normal to me. They just happened to take their lives into their hands every time they went to church. And in fact, they and other churches like them, scattered about a multi-state area, were the only American Christians I knew who were willing to die for their faith. Here's the verses. I don't know if you can read it. But this is what they base their beliefs on. And where these Pentecostals take issue with other Christians, they say, well, look, you believe in exorcism, you believe in speaking in tongues, you believe in laying hands on the sick, but whoa, what's this thing in here taking up? Why is it that you don't believe in taking up serpents and drinking poison? Now, drinking poison, unfortunately, I don't have a photo of them doing it here. They have like a mason jar on their the pulpit, and they have strychnine, which I didn't know is a powder. You add water to it, mix it, and they pick it there. And when they feel the spirit fall, people will go up and slug a couple swallows of strychnine. In fact, one of the guys I was interviewing, he said strychnine was just too babyish. He wanted to drink something called Red Devil, which is some sort of really poisonous stuff. But he felt like, well, if God would protect him through, from strychnine, and he could protect him, anything, furniture cleaners, and car oil, whatever. He'll just pour it down. But anyway, that's the verse. This is all based on, in case you're theologically inclined. Anyway, this is, I don't know if you can see this very well. Turned out, our reason, the photographer and I, the reason for going there, to find out how snake handling is dying out, turned out not to be true. In fact, there was more people than I knew had really picked it up. So the article I wrote on these folks was mainly a profile on Mac Wolford, an entertaining preacher who traveled about the region, encouraging pastors to turn their churches into snake handling congregations. Now, one thing the reporter has to do, no matter how you feel about a certain person or a certain custom, it's kind of your job to make this person at least somewhat sympathetic. At least try to be fair to them. And you'd hear fair and balanced, but you at least try to give this person the benefit of the doubt. So, and Mac was an entertaining kind of guy. You'll see a picture of him in just a minute. He had a less than stellar past, drunkenness, adultery, you name it, all the sins. But he had kind of come back to the Lord, he said, and he was handling snakes. Profile came out in November 2011. Didn't attract much notice at the time. But Mac had told the photographer of a preacher named Andrew Hamlin, who was only 20. And he'd started his own snake handling in church in eastern Tennessee. So the photographer called me and she said, "What are you doing New Year's weekend?" I said, "Well, not much." And she says, well, let's drive 530 miles to East Tennessee. Nothing better to do. So down I-81 we went. And there was this church filled with young people, many of them newly off drugs. Again, eastern Tennessee's major meth lab, a lot of meth production there. It's kind of interesting in Appalachia. people were bringing in glass top boxes full of rattlesnakes, water moccasins, and copperheads, which are the local poisonous variety of reptile you can get there. Now, just for those of you who are into reptiles, water moccasins and copperheads don't usually kill you, but rattlesnakes usually do. And they almost always will. It was a very dramatic service. The preacher himself, in fact, got snake bit at the stroke of midnight, and he kind of sunk to the ground. But fortunately, the serpent we think he only put one fang into the guy's finger because he didn't drop dead. So we took Andrew out to dinner. Andrew is the one in the middle. He's wearing a purple shirt. He's the one in the middle, and to his left is Micah, who is one of the few black serpent handlers. It's a pretty white group of, most of the people who do it, but he's one of the few who are not. That was Micah Golden, and Andrew Hamlin is in the middle. That's during a worship service. And what really got me was not so much the young 20-year-old preacher, but it was his wife, who was 7.5 months pregnant, was, throwing rattlesnakes back and forth. And I mean, her husband said later, oh yeah, she handles them like they're kittens. And I just thought, it's one thing for if you feel like, you're supposed to be, holding a rattlesnake, but to do it to your unborn child, really? And there have been people in this movement, there have been pregnant women who've died of snake bite in church services, so it has been known to happen. I mean, I just wanted to crawl under the pew when I saw her. I just thought, I've covered weird things in my life, but this takes the cake. Anyway, I took notes. A few months later, needed some more freelance money, so I remembered a certain editor at the Wall Street Journal. The only editor there I knew. I emailed him to say, hey, do you want a story on 20-something Pentecostal serpent handlers who use Facebook to, spread their custom, which I'd forgotten to mention. These folks were super active on Facebook. And you could see all their theological arguments on their feeds. I mean, people were sending them notes saying, like, you're nuts, you're satanic, you're a jerk. And they would debate, the various theologies of, are you tempting God versus, people would throw verses at each other. And I thought, again, if you're someone who's kind of interested in religion, faith stuff, you think this is so cutting edge. I mean, Facebook, death every Sunday, 20-somethings. I mean, it doesn't get better. So anyway, yes, this Wall Street Journal editor wanted the story. It ran Easter weekend 2012. This is the photo from the story. It got 37,000 hits over 2 days, which is pretty good. Even for the journal, it's good. And that was before Drudge picked it up. Okay. But unbelievably, 6 weeks later, I hope you can all read the white stuff printing down there. 6 weeks later, Mac Wolford was at an evangelistic service at a state park in West Virginia. And what he was doing is he was having, a lot of people were saying, now, we don't do this just because we just like, handling rattlesnakes. We want to convert people and get them to meet God. And so, but it was their way of getting people, people would be driving by in a car and they'd see a snake handling service and they would, jump out of the car, run into church and get converted. I mean, that was their hope. So anyway, he was at a state park trying to bring just people who happened to be there over Memorial Day weekend to come to his church service, and he had a couple rattlers. And he wanted the non-converted to stop by. But one of his trusted yellow rattlers, might have been a canebrake, but I can't remember, bit him. He had been bitten before, but this time it was fatal. I wasn't there. The photographer was. That when they took him back to Bluefield, which was the nearest city, she sat by his side while he took about 8 hours to die. And how you die is all your organs just shut down. Kidneys, everything, heart, goes. It's not a fun way to go. His father had died the same way from a snake bite at a church service. His father was a pastor 38 years before. So he knew what he was getting into. He knew what could happen to him. And the moment he got bit and he knew he was dying, I mean, he had watched his father die and he knew. And he did not call for medical help. The photographer, meanwhile, and some of these snake handlers have been known to linger for days. The photographer was having a major ethics battle with herself. One more thing before I go back. A lot of people will say, well, why don't you get medical help? Why don't you call 911? Well, they believe that if God told them to handle snakes, God can heal them. If he heals them, that is good. If he doesn't, it's their time to go. Okay, but they do not seek out hospitals, doctors, whatever. In fact, those who do are accused of having a lack of faith, and they lose a lot of faith among the snake handling community. Well, so he died one day after his 44th birthday. The photographer was just, again, in a horrible bind. She thought, what do I do? I mean, and she was, I was 400 miles away, and she was there. And she said, do I call 911? At what point do you manipulate a news story? If someone is killing themselves, do you try to stop them? Well, okay, if they're under 18, you might make a case, well, yeah, you do. But if they're over 18, they've been doing this dangerous kind of activity for some time, which is, they know what they're doing. This guy is actually a pastor. If he wants to die and he's going to wait for God to heal him, or he will die waiting, do you let him die? Well, she decided that it would so violate his beliefs for her to call the ambulance. She decided not to, and no one else did either. Until the very end, for some reason, someone did. By the time the medics got there, he was gone. Well, anyway, she called me the next day. She said Mac was dead, and I, being a mercenary sort of person, called the Post, and I thought, a story. And they wanted a story right away. It was atop their style section. It was the top drawing story on their website for at least 36 hours. I got more than 1,400 comments. Again, Drudge picked it up. Drudge likes this stuff. CNN.com called, we want a story. That got 6,500 comments. And I'm not just dropping names to mention these places. I'm just saying a lot of these places are media organizations that could care less about anything having to do with values, faith, religion, whatever. But the snake handlers, they just love this stuff. They eat it up. They do. I'm like, why is this? We're in a society where people are quitting church in record numbers. As you know, I read about it in the book over there. But you can buy it. It's only $10. But anyway, most people, I know some of the statistics on non-attenders, but most people profess no interest in religion, but right as people, the media, that is, the media people are kind of notorious for not believing, having personal faith. But write the story about a death of a serpent handler, and I got more readers on those stories than I ever gotten in 30 years of journalism. And people all over the world were reading. I was getting calls from, why my mind is blanked out, BBC. BBC. But no, folks in London, the Brits are just fascinated with the wacko Americans' religious habits. They just think we're totally weird. And if you are ever a reporter at some of these events, in fact, a lot of people you run into are Brits reporting on this. I began to realize, people are interested by those who take their faith seriously, being either they're Amish or they're serpent handlers. The Amish, the girls who were killed, same thing, a massive outpouring of interest, journalists all over the place. Because everyone thought, they asked the big questions, and that's what, as journalists at least, you try to answer it, or at least bring it up. Why would 5 girls, one girl, I think, she, if I remember, I was out of the country when this happened, but I think she kind of she helped block another girl from dying, or anyway, or, why would 5 girls die for their faith? What would lead them to do that? What would lead the Amish to forgive them? It was such a crazy story, and it's gripping. Everyone wants to read it. I began to realize that my calling's not just to do interesting stories, but to do stories that might bring a change in people, whether it's female feticide or whether it's, I did something once on people who adopt Down syndrome children. And I thought, there's like 200 families waiting to adopt a Down syndrome child. I thought if this can, maybe one less person abort their kid, and if they know they're pregnant with a Down syndrome child, if they know there's people waiting to adopt their kid, maybe they might not go through an abortion. It might be one less trauma, So I thought, can we do stories that actually change people, that make people, that get them interested in something that might change their lives? If I could get people out of their own cells, I've thought, thinking about what has meaning, what about life, death, eternity, I will have succeeded. By the way, this woman, if you can't read the printing, they do something called handling fire. They put an open flame to their skin. They'll take a Coke bottle, put a wick filled with soaked in gas, light the flame. I don't know why it has to be a Coke bottle, but anyway. And they hold it to their hands. I've seen this. And in fact, one guy, he was tearing off his shoes and holding it to the soles of his feet. He put on his shoes, walked out of church, and I raced after him and I said, take off your shoes. And I want to see your feet. And I mean, I had a notepad. I was obviously a reporter, and I was like, the skeptic. But I really didn't, not a burn on his feet. I was like, I don't know. Some people say, oh, they're so sweaty. It's not really, that's why they don't get burned. I thought, well, yeah, you try doing it. So anyway, I decided to follow some of these handlers. I felt they were some of the most interesting people in American religion today because there was something pure about them. They faced death willingly for their beliefs, at least once or twice a week. They have their faults, believe me. It's a kind of crazy culture at times, but there's something about them that is still unspoiled by modern life. Same thing with the Amish. You can see kind of some parallels. It turns out I got a job in Tennessee soon after these stories ran. It made it easier for me to visit serpent handlers. I began to see a book in this, to be honest, which I'm working on now. I began visiting churches up and down Appalachia, and I got to know some of the old-timer pastors who've been in this for a while, sitting down and talking to people, seeing the humanity of these folks, people that most journalists will call freaks, but they're not. They're parents, they're citizens. They just happen to handle snakes on Sundays. In fact, my daughter got to the point that she began to think, it's normal to have snakes in church. We were at so many services. So anyway, I would chat with them. I felt I was back 50 years in a culture where people talked on Facebook again of dressing modestly, not offending God, always trusting him. A culture where the men, it's almost like Muslim men, the Pentecostal men, they don't wear short sleeves. They wear long sleeves. If you ever go to these services, you'll see everybody has long sleeves on. It's like, this is just too much. It's hot in those states. So anyway, I'd covered religion since I was in high school, but these people were from another era. I didn't want them to disappear. I wanted them to be a part of us. Hung out with them, became friends with them. And that's the thing with journalists. You try not to become too much one with your story, but you become friends. People ask about your kids, you ask about their kids. And Andrew Hamlin, the young pastor, he's handling a rattler at one of his recent revivals. In fact, I went to his service on New Year's Eve. I don't know if you can see this. It's almost like he's like almost like a communion thing. It's like a sacrament. He's holding up these. He has about 5 in his hands right now. So I was sitting there New Year's Eve. There were no other photographers present. I thought, with my iPad, I was taking pictures. I thought, if he drops dead, I'm the only one here to record it. So he didn't drop dead. Fortunately, he didn't get bit. And their lives, I'll tell you, they're quite dramatic. Because of the journal piece, both Andrew and another serpent handler in Kentucky known as Jamie Coots were stars on a reality TV show, Snake Salvation. Don't know if any of you did any of you watch National Geographic, but it really was called Snake Salvation. It was 16 episodes. And it was pretty amazing. Soon after it ended, Andrew got arrested by the Tennessee wildlife authorities for illegally keeping 50-plus poisonous snakes, which they said was against the law. It took several courthouse appearances and a grand jury investigation to declare him innocent. There is one thing about folks in Appalachia. In other words, they may not like what you do, but they don't want the law. They don't like the law. They really resent the state messing with you even more. So people actually stood up for Andrew, at least the grand jury did. In fact, I took this picture outside the courthouse of a group of people. Jamie Coots, by the way, was a favorite of a growing number of journalists who had been covering this movement. Jovial 42-year-old pastor, he's the guy in the middle. He had everyone's respect and was known for giving us certain background details as to what was really going on in the serpent handling culture, because could be really backbiting too. And so in mid-February, though, at a Saturday night service, Jamie picked up a rattlesnake that had been handled all evening. It bit him, and he was dead within a few minutes. I don't know if any of you tracked, it was all over the news in February. So when you get TMZ attending a funeral of a serpent handler, it's in the secular media. TMZ, really? So anyway, and that was packed with the media. The first time Mac died, I was the only person who had the story because the Post had been covering him. But this time they'd been on Snake Salvation, and National Geographic had sent out PR pictures. So the story was everywhere. A lot of journalists knew about it. Even the people hundreds of people attended his funeral a few days later. Even the people who disagreed with him theologically, and that was most of the town, but they loved his kindness and gentle personality, and his death was a huge blow to the movement. So, but, you know, yeah, again, these were some of the, this is at a revival in May. Younger men were ready to move into his place. Coots' 21-year-old son, Cody, became pastor in his stead 3 months later at Andrew Hamlin's homecoming at his La Follette, Tennessee church. This is all Eastern Tennessee. You know, he was obviously, people were admitting that he had become, it was a who's who of serpent handlers at his church. He was kind of the acknowledged head of serpent handlers. He was a reality TV star. Jamie was dead. And these 20-year-olds, and I mean, he's like 23. The other, Jamie's son is 21. And you're talking pretty young people who are moving into this movement. And again, they're all into social media. I mean, there's even a group on Facebook called Serpent Handling Musicians. Look it up. They exist. Anyway, it's clear that Andrew had to carry the torch. So there's so much more to the story, and I won't go, you know, I'll stop there about the serpent handlers. But what I wanted to say, I'm not one of those people who think journalism is going away anytime soon. I know our business model is having major problems. That is, getting people to pay for our product. But human beings are always curious, and they always want to know information. It's the popularity of these stories that showed me that journalism isn't dead at all. And I mean, we're still, again, trying to figure out how to get people to pay for our information, but at some point, we'll get it on how to get people to contribute at least a little for what we write and photograph. There's still news as long as most of us are willing to travel to Iraq, Ukraine, or even New York or Appalachia to cover it, and so that the rest of you don't have to. In fact, Vogue magazine has a piece now on the rise of new indie independent magazines. These are expensive publications on, you know, really spiffo stock and about unusual topics. Apparently they're growing because people are sick of their Facebook news feeds and they long for something tactile between their hands. It's on Vogue's website, so go read it. You know, and even campus newspapers, we've learned that more people read them if they're physically available. I mean, they don't always go to the website, but if it's sitting there outside, you know, the cafeteria, people will grab it. So don't give up on journalists. Don't give up on journalism. As long as there is everything from popes to people, to popes becoming saints, to people who handle snakes, we have a job to do. Thank you very much.